This is Mae Brussell. It's broadcast number 664, August the 27th, 1984. The news we shared just a year ago this week, and those stories are still in the news at the present time. Benigno Aquino was murdered in the Philippines. That was just a year ago, and I'll do more about the investigation of that murder that has been kept up to exposing probably the highest military officers in the Philippines 1 year after his murder. I also was doing a great deal in the weeks a year ago on John DeLorean. That story is very much in the news, and we'll continue with the DeLorean expose in detail because there are certain parts of the DeLorean story I want to re-emphasize because of their importance to the Nazi connections, and the Nazi connections go right back to our CIA and the murder of John Kennedy, and I'm not going to lose those threads for you, even though there are many pressing stories in the news. I want to keep you updated on the DeLorean story. I did have a diagram or a chart just a year ago this week, another one of those diagrams, on the link of the Vatican and Vatican intelligence with Father Felix Morleon, who moved to the United States, William Donovan of the OSS, who funded Morleon while the war was going on, and then the Grand Cross Award, the Order of St. Sylvester, given to Donovan, and James Angleton knighted. And that was just a year ago that we were talking about those things, and I want to go back to those stories again in terms of the news this week and the celebration in France where the Nazis surrendered, and they had various parades and things this year. When it happened that the Nazis surrendered in Paris, they had no idea in their minds at all, I know, that Mr. Donovan and Alan Dulles and James Angleton at that very moment, or a year before the surrender even, were making arrangements for the Nazis to come back into power. I was talking about the network of the OSS, the CIA, Mussolini, and the Vatican, and in that year, and particularly with one new book that just came out, it is more and more evident how strong the links were with the people who funded Hitler in the wars, to start his wars, playing a major role in setting up World War III and the process of arming and infiltrating all labor and so-called leftist organizations to get us to the point where we are today, the full cycle in Dallas with the Republican Convention and Young Americans for Freedom. So last year I was talking about these very important connections. If you don't have that tape, it's number 612. You should add it to part of your collection if you're new listeners. I think all of them are important, but this ties back to many things that, as I say, are in the news today. I don't have time now this week, of course, but in the weeks to come, just briefly to mention the Hitler diary trials is going on. Don't pass that off as just a cover-up to make a few bucks. They made many millions and gave us the Waffen-SS. Be reading those articles. I'll be doing a lot on Ronald Reagan, the New Right, and Jerry Falwell. An update on Ed Meese, the Reagan appointments, the efforts for the new Constitution, Reagan's plans for Grenada, the FBI investigating those forged documents, blaming the KGB for sending letters at the time of the Olympics. There are many important stories. Also, last week I talked about that war conference here in Monterey at the Navy Postgraduate School of the top echelon who would be responsible for invading Cuba or Nicaragua and eventually making war with the Soviet Union. And just this week after that conference, there were articles on the news media in the Pentagon and how they'll handle the future invasions. And that is terribly important. There's so many articles on that, it would take one program alone. And George Shultz promising that we should free all of Europe. And there are stories that relate to past broadcasts that I hope I'll someday be able to get on the air. But these are a few that I want to develop for you as soon as possible. But don't think I'm ignoring them now. If you see them in the news, I notice they're there, but we, of course, have only 1 hour a week, and I'll get back to them eventually. Now, the Republican convention was over. Abe Melenkoff of the San Francisco Chronicle, who writes a little editorial article, he has a column every 5 days a week, not every day, has a story, Memory of Kennedy Still Alive in Dallas, and he tells about the special burden of guilt for the mayor and the Republican convention, how the mayor hoped that the President Kennedy's assassination story was, quote, done, gone, and forgiven. Mayor A. Stark Taylor thought that this would be a time to forgive and forget Dallas and show how gracious they are. And then he goes on to say remarks about the arson that was set at the Texas School Book Depository, and that this story seemed to make the news the same day as the president's acceptance speech, sort of crowding out the acceptance speech or reminding him that this building was there. They tried to erase it by refurbishing the building. They renamed it the Dallas County Administration Building. Mellencamp, of course, says that's where Lee Harvey Oswald hid and fired John Kennedy, fired the rifle on John Kennedy. Of course, Abe Mellencamp, the brother of Sherman Mellencamp, Sherman is the head of the UCLA School of Medicine. I went through Beverly High with these fellows. I knew them when I was younger, particularly Sherman, and then he went off to Stanford. He's head of the medical school and hires Dr. Jolly West of the CIA, who gave that 1 second epilepsy of Jack Ruby when he killed Lee Harvey Oswald. The important thing about that story, of course, is not only was the President of the United States murdered there, but the man who allegedly shot him said, I'm innocent, and 2 days later he's killed in the police department, and they think that that memory will wash away. Well, somebody set fire to the building. Nobody knows who. It's a brick building. Was it symbolic? Did they want to remind people of it? Did they want the electronic news to keep saying over and over for another generation, this is where Lee Harvey Oswald shot John Kennedy? The printed papers were different. The Los Angeles Times says the Texas School Book Depository is the brick structure from which Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly fired the shots that killed President John Kennedy. I mentioned the allegedly that's in the building a few weeks ago. Some of the Kennedy memorabilia was destroyed, and of course this reminds me very much of Nazi Germany trying to destroy these items so that we don't have to live or face them. At one time they were going to tear the whole building down. It's ridiculous to think, I guess, that a fire would do it, but it certainly called attention to the event when when Ronald Reagan was there with the convention. The Los Angeles Herald-Examiner quotes 4 newsmen from Texas, and some of them had a very big role, 3 of them, of covering up the murder of John Kennedy. One was Dan Rather, the other was Walter Cronkite, and the other was Bill Moyers, press secretary for Lyndon Johnson, and also Bob Schieffer, Schieffer. All 4 of those men come from Texas. Dan Rather had a particularly important role in covering up this murder. Not only was he there at the time of the assassination, but when the Abraham Zapruder films are shown and Kennedy's head goes backward, indicating a frontal shot, he on the film says over and over again the head goes forward. Well, Dan Rather thought in an interview that it was silly to hold Dallas responsible or to link it with the Kennedy assassination. This is a quotation from Rather. He says, many Americans are not old enough to remember the Kennedy assassination. And after all, Los Angeles was where Robert Kennedy was killed, and you didn't find people moping around about that. That's old Dan Rather. You can take him or leave him, but he continues, like, what are you worrying about that? Robert Kennedy was not a president of the United States, but he was running against Richard Nixon, who lost to John Kennedy, and then Sirhan survived. He was not killed in the Los Angeles Police Department. So to compare us, or to say who's moping and who isn't moping, I don't think that he's the right person to quote in the paper, but of course he's been part of that for 20 years, and how else do you make the multi-million bucks on the major TV channels, but read your lines and read them well. Now, getting back to the Aquino murder in the Philippines, 1 year later, news story, top officer linked in plot to kill Aquino. The panel may accuse the nation's top military officer of ordering the killing, that they suggested that he was involved in the killing. Another article, 500,000 staged an anti-Marcos march in Manila on the anniversary of this death. And another story, I have maybe a year's supply of stories, and I don't know how carefully you've been following in your newspapers. Here's one. Mystery still shrouds opposition leader's death. Unsolved Aquino assassination brings discontent and changes the Philippines. Quite a contradiction here. Marcos of the Philippines is a military dictator who doesn't want opposition or elections. But in the military dictatorship, there's a panel that has more freedom than the Warren Commission. We are supposed to be a free country. People think we have free news media, free access. Our courts work. They don't work. We don't have freedom. The Warren Commission was filled with influence and lies and people that should have been off of there, like John J. McCloy and Gerald Ford, put on there by Richard Nixon and Allen Dulles of the CIA. They had a vested interest in keeping the Russian, Tsarist Russian, Nazi, Vatican, mafia connections away from the investigation, and they did it, and they lied to the American people. So with all our elaborate investigations, there's more freedom in the Philippines to continue the investigation than there is in the United States. This week, the French commemorated the liberation of Paris. Big celebration, and on August the 25th, 1944, was the surrender of the German command, and the people today were out there celebrating this liberation. And as I said before, little did they know what was going on. While they were happy that the Nazis surrendered, August 25th, 1944, go back to that little diagram I have on broadcast number 612 and see what was going on while these people thought they were going to be free. It's just ridiculous. This new book that I like very much, the new one on Delle Chaie, that I will be quoting over and over again, Stefano Delle Chaie, and Tom Davis from Research will be obtaining those books. It's published in London, and he's going to get them. Many of you have his address. If not, I'll give it to you later or on the next broadcast. He will try, and he will be able to get this book and make it available to you. And just the part about France I want to refer to because of the celebration this week. And early in the book, it tells how the CIA, the National Security Council, which just got into operation by 1947, by March of 48, the National Security Council was funding the Italian legislature and influencing the Italian election and setting up clandestine anti-communist movements with financial help and military help from the United States government. A Colonel J. Willems, W-I-L-L-E-M-S, has a document, The Importance of Recognizing Revolutionary Anti-Communist Forces, which were in fact directly from Mussolini's secret guard, his Gestapo, the OVRA, the O-V-R-A, those are the capital letters, that was set up like Licio Jelly. Now the first thing we did, the CIA did, it was to purge the socialist and pro-resistance elements in their administration. This came out of the United States Embassy in Rome by February the 10th, 1948, set up a new police corps with U.S. advisors and the OVRA veterans, those are Mussolini's veterans, and this police corps will be similar to the venture in France. You see, we had Klaus Barbie in our control with Henry Kissinger from 1945. In 1944, they were celebrating in Paris. They were rid of the Nazis, and a few months later, when the war was over in 1945, Henry Kissinger was sent into the 970th Detachment, later renamed the 66th CIC Detachment, and I have charts on those and have done programs on that. And that new book, The Price of Power by Seymour Hersh, tells about Henry Kissinger at Omer Amagau with the displaced people and the Nazi, former Nazis from Nazi Germany who were going to work with other Nazi collaborators, and Klaus Barbie had a hold on France and set up these cells before the CIA came into Italy. That's very important to remember the chronology here, that we had Klaus Barbie with John J. McCloy and Allen Dulles and Henry Kissinger and, of course, Fritz Kramer in Germany setting up the network in France. So Italy was to copy the example of France, and this book on Delle Chaie, on the origins of the resurgence of Nazism and fascism, says to combat the threat of communism, France had organized small, efficient police cells. Keep in mind now The Los Angeles Police Department, the Anti-Terrorist Division, the Police Intelligence Division, J. Paul, with links to the Pentagon, to Mr. John Siglaub of Western Goals in Taiwan with the World Anti-Communist League, and Edward Teller with the hydrogen bomb and the Defense Department Space Wars. Our police departments are set up like these cells, and these cells were organized from the end of 1945, 46 to 48, in France, in Italy, and then, of course, in the United States. This book says, to repeat this, France organized small, efficient police cells outside the normal police structure, but under the supervision of the national security. These cells were equipped with finance and exceptional resources and personnel. They were limited in number, a few, trained to perfection for their task. Italy then set up their secret anti-communist police group, relying on the old-fashioned secret police to provide the basic personnel at structure and organization levels. And it goes on, and I'll do more on this in this book, of course, continuously every week. The group was under the organization of James Angleton, and of course Allen Dulles and Angleton worked closely with each other in Bern, Switzerland, and in the OSS, and with the Vatican. Both of those names I have associated on charts and in articles, in the Rebel article I did on the Nazis and the JFK assassination. So this week, when the French were celebrating their 40 years of freedom since they kicked out the Nazis, I wish that some of the people in France would get a little modern and go to this literature, or maybe they have, I don't know, and put the connections there, not only of Barbie, who's been arrested but hasn't been tried for 2 years, who's sitting there, to the relationship of the United States security as soon as our CIA was formed, and before it was formed, in the OSS, and then the Special Operations Division and the Special Services Unit that incorporated Nazis, used the expertise of Hitler and Mussolini, the Gestapo, the OVRA, then moved to United States of America to set up our police departments with these anti-terrorist divisions. That's why the word terrorist is so important. The excuse for these people is their terrorist divisions. Now, this is the anniversary on September the 1st of the Korean airline going down. And there's an article coming out from the Soviet Union claiming the United States bomb blew up the 007. Moscow radio said yesterday that the Korean airline was shot down by the Soviet when they attacked them. They sent a missile that would down them, similar to Gary Powers of the U-2 spy ship being down so they could tell the world that they had captured the spy ship. The allegations of the Soviet Union, repeated through John Keppel, who was important in our State Department and also worked in the Soviet Union. This story is, and maybe you've read it by now, that when they told the American plane, not the American, it had Larry McDonald on, the Korean airline, to stop, or they fired a missile. A few seconds after that, a bomb went off, and this suggests that it was detonated after the jet fired its missile, and they wanted to get the plane down to prove it was a spying mission, but the plane had a explosion on it that blew it up. It was destroyed by an explosion, and this is similar as Gary Powers was supposed to take cyanide and kill himself. Of course, he was the only one on that plane, but in this case, this plane, according to the new article in the Soviet Union, was bombed either by a kerosene explosion or a remote-controlled bomb. The article on this comes from the Soviet Union and from Italy, and the allegations were that this was a spying plane. Of course, we know that a year later. And to give credit to Larry Flint, and he sure paid his dues for doing it, he was the first person who ran full-page articles in the newspaper saying, "Stop that hysteria about the 007. I think it's a provocateur situation." This week in the Monterey Herald, there was a story, Korean jet shot down a year ago Saturday. Mystery still shrouds Flight 007 fate. And this article is more liberal than what we saw a year ago, or when I wrote my story on the Korean airline. It says, new questions have been raised, new data asserted, new answers proposed. the chances are the public will never know the answers to these questions. And then it goes on how the United States stressed through George Shultz how horrible the Soviet Union was, that we reacted with revulsion to the attack, and how President Reagan was so critical. And then it goes on to say within days, the U.S. officials began softening their criticism, particularly their contention that the Russians knowingly destroyed a civilian plane. So that's an update on the Korean airline. This story, as they say, we may never know, because when they don't want you to know, a lot of the facts are kept hidden. If they had radio transcripts of the Soviet Union talking to the Korean pilot, then Japan had the same transcripts of what the Korean pilot was thinking or doing at the time. And that is the gist of what I wrote about, that it was a kamikaze situation to make a martyr out of Larry McDonald, similar to John Birch, who was killed over China, get rid of him with the Western Goals investigation, and dump him at the same time because of the links of the police department, which again goes back to the Gestapo. You can't have that in the news, and he was the man who put in the computers that would link the Los Angeles Police Department to the Pentagon by way of his offices. That's a good reason enough to unload this guy, and that's what I said a year ago. I started writing that article within days after the crash. Larry Flynn held it up for about a month or two because they wanted to check every single reference before it was printed in the Hustler. Now, in the convention, I want to mention a part of the Republican convention, just one segment of it, that is very pertinent to the research that I've done for so many years. The Washington Times is running full-page pictures of Ronald Reagan, and I would like to do just 1 hour on Reverend Moon's newspaper and the way they're covering the stories. Naturally, it's slanted, but you cannot imagine unless you take it. And you might take it. It's $22 for 3 months, and you'll get the best reading. You can't buy current books on the news that you would get out of the Washington Times, particularly with the elections coming up. But Wednesday, August 22nd, 1984, page 12B, the Washington Times has a full-page picture and a story, Young Americans for Freedom. For over 24 years, the nation's largest conservative youth organization, with national chairman Robert E. Dolan, and they have printed the Sharon Statement, S-H-A. The Sharon Statement is about 12 paragraphs that was written in Sharon, Connecticut, S-H-A-R-O-N, Connecticut, at the home of William Buckley, and it is what Young Americans for Freedom is about. Below that is a picture about 8 inches tall. This covers a full page of the American troops with a flag similar to the posture of Iwo Jima, all hands standing around this flag. U.S. troops liberate Grenada. Now, Grenada was the place where the soldiers of fortune agent Mr. Brown was on the island, right along with our military, where Michael Ledeen was there rummaging through papers. Ledeen working with Licio Gelli, the Vatican, the Disinformation Service. A big inch column victory over communism. And Ronald Reagan is planning to go down there in October, just as General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippines. This is a visual election, and the people, and all the people who sat silent about that invasion and the meaning of that invasion, have lost the point. The Young Americans for Freedom are proud of that. And then below that is a picture of Ronald Reagan, one of the first founding members of Young Americans for Freedom, and they want a membership. But with the election in Dallas, Texas, not the election, the nomination of Ronald Reagan in Dallas, Texas in 1984, we make a full cycle from the Moon paper to the Young Americans for Freedom, the Sharon Statement, the Grenada, the Ronald Reagan, published on Wednesday, and Reagan took his acceptance speech on Thursday, the same day that the book depository was set on fire. Now, in the Rebel article that I did in November of 1983, on the section on 1960, I put it in chronological order how the teams were set up to murder John Kennedy. And in 1960, I wrote about Young Americans for Freedom. In 1960, candidate Richard Nixon was qualified for the job of president. A lot of influential people were sure he was the only choice. Nixon was familiar with every Red Scare tactic, from his first campaign against Jerry Voorhees in 1946 versus Helen Douglas in the Senate, working for Senator Joe McCarthy. He knew it well. The prosecution of Alger Hess with flimsy evidence proved his value alone. I'm reading what I put into print just a year ago, less than a year ago now. But Nixon had accumulated strong connections with members of the crime syndicate, the Vatican hierarchy, defense industry, and known Nazis. He knew them all. What if he lost after 17 years of preparation? Would there be a backup team for the future? Could the Pentagon or Reinhard Gehlen visualize leaving the entire United States presidency to chance election? I'm reading this to you now, and many of you have the article, because as you read new books coming out all the time, there's new information, such as this one on Delle Chaie, or the Seymour Hersh book of Henry Kissinger with the top Nazis in Germany after the war, and Fritz Kramer, or James Angleton with the Vatican setting up the fascist cells, and with Klaus Barbie in France, Italy, Germany, and the United States. Would they leave it to chance that John Kennedy would be elected? No, they had already controlled the major countries in Europe. Why would they leave that election to chance? And that's what I asked. And I wrote, remember what happened to Senator Robert Kennedy on the eve of the primary victory in 1968. They can't get that close to losing it again, and they had to do away with him. With both Kennedys gone, Nixon finally made it. And just last week, you read in all the wire service stories, declassified documents, how the Democratic candidates were all threatened with death in 1968. Hubert Humphrey, Eugene McCarthy, and of course George Wallace was shot in he wasn't a Democratic candidate. I guess he was. He was shot when he was running against Nixon in 1972 because he was taking too many votes against Nixon at that time. Nixon was supposed to be elected, and Ronald Reagan would follow him. And I wrote in the Rebel, September 1960, 2 months before the elections, William F. Buckley Jr. launched the Young Americans for Freedom from the grounds on his Connecticut estate. That is the Sharon statement that they wrote at the time. Prior to that date, Buckley's career was with conservatives. After he graduated from Yale, he served the CIA in Japan from 1950 to 1954. He did a stint in the CIA with Mexico with E. Howard Hunt. He was co-founder of Young Americans for Freedom with Douglas Caddy, whose offices later were used by the CIA and the Howard used for dirty tricks during the Watergate story and getting Richard Nixon reelected at that time. They needed the dirty tricks out of the Mullen Associates. And then I went on that the Young Americans for Freedom was, during the Reagan-Nixon years, were conducted by Tom Charles Houston, and that was the Operation Chaos, the COINTEL program that Nixon cooked up. And in the Rebel, I wrote the Selected Advisory Board for YAF was a who's who of oldies. Even at that time, Senator Strom Thurmond, Senator John Tower, Mr. Ronald Reagan, General Charles Willoughby from the Philippines and from Germany, and Mr. Robert Morris. Now, William Buckley and Robert Morris are Knights of Malta, and I went back to the Nazi connections of Senator Joe McCarthy. They both worked with him. And, of course, going from Young Americans for Freedom to 1961, a year after Buckley founded Young Americans for Freedom, the group from Munich, Germany, that were to take over the YAF moved to Fort Worth, Dallas area to Mr. Robert Morris, who would be their host. And, of course, they were involved in the murder of John Kennedy, and the John Birch Society helped fund them and their activities with General Walker and that gang. And, of course, Mr. H.L. Hunt's home was used, and I mentioned that for the Republican convention. So this is the full cycle of YAF, not investigated, covered up. I don't believe any researcher outside of myself has ever lingered on this evidence in 20 years, and I want to know why. Isn't that strange? The time is up now for this first half of the tape. We'll continue in the second half in one moment. This is Mae Brussell, and it's broadcast number 664, August 27th, 1984, Side 2. I want to bring up two subjects that are literally flooding the news and just briefly try to expose the way entrapment works, the dirty tricks work, with CIA Director William Casey and his expertise going back to Watergate. The whole Watergate team working with Richard Nixon moved on to Ronald Reagan's White House in every sense of the word, and their dirty tricks are becoming visible all of the time. One has to do with Senator Mark Hatfield, who is running for the Senate in Oregon, who is a Republican, but is one of the liberal Republicans who's marked, similar to Lowell Weicker, to be removed. The Young Turks want them out of the way. He's an ecologist and a fairly decent man who's been there with seniority. Now, there are a lot of stories how this particular Greek gentleman influenced him and gave his wife a hunk of money a few years back in order to influence the government to put a pipeline, an oil pipeline, which indeed went through, but had given them, Hatfield, some money, which last week they just coughed up a $55,000 loan they had to take to put to a charity out of embarrassment. Doesn't solve anything. But this particular gentleman from Greece, Mr. Basil Sakos, Tsakos, and you may remember the columns starting a while back. Jack Anderson's been carrying them, and then it developed into the news. This is one of Jack Anderson's great stories, like the ITT, the D to Baird, only this time it's the Democrats that he's working on. And in the matter of bringing up the arrangement that Mr. Sakos came to Washington, D.C., and he went to the Senator Hatfield and wanted him to meet people in Washington and get this oil pipeline from Saudi Arabia across Africa so they wouldn't depend on the Persian Gulf. The government actually went along with it. But Jack Anderson has a story about the seedy connections. He's been doing the seedy connections of this Basil Sakos, who isn't merely an oil engineer. He gets high commissions and sets people up, and he's an international arms dealer, similar to Samuel Cummings, whose headquarters are in Monte Carlo and lives in London. And it tells about his trying to sell Greece weapons, tanks from West Germany, 100 Leopard tanks, and wanting a $10 million commission. And it tells about his role with Swiss bank accounts and deposits for introducing various people to the arrangements he makes for weapons. And just this last week, Jack Anderson had a story that when Sakos came to this country in 1980, he hooked up with an entrepreneur named Frank Rosenbaum. They were introduced by an ex-congressman, ex-convict Cornelius Gallagher, a Democrat from New Jersey, who figured in the influence buying of Tongsun Park. So Sakos is linked to these Korean connections, again, the Reverend Moon connections, and the influence buying in Congress. And it also goes on that records of Mr. Rosenbaum show that he and Mr. Sakos met with representatives of Rockwell and a French firm to discuss the sale of security surveillance to Saudi Arabia. So he's involved not only with Saudi Arabia and Tongsun Park, but he's a close associate with what they say an ex-CIA agent who arranged the meeting and to have Sakos represent Rockwell in selling aircraft and missiles to Morocco, Tunisia, and Abu Dhabi. So DHABI. Well, and he also was trying to work with General Dynamics and sell their tanks to Greece. Rockwell International is represented by William French Smith. Frank Rosenbaum has links to, and these associates of this Gallagher, to Tongsun Park. And it's very easy that they would latch themselves on to a senator, Mark Hatfield, because every time there's an election, every few years, congressmen, representatives, or the Senate, the Young Americans for Freedom are targeting those people to get them out of office, and I mentioned this before, so they have control of the entire Congress. The New York Times had a story last week. Ex-CIA official tells of request to help win support for the pipeline. That's Admiral Bobby Inman, who is National Security Advisor. He's in charge of the National Security Agency. He was Deputy Director of the CIA. 2 years ago, he was asked to help win the United States government support from Basil Sakos, that same Greek entrepreneur, who gave this money to the wife of Mark Hatfield. Now, she's a real estate agent and allegedly gave her this huge amount, $55,000, to help promote the venture or find an apartment at the Watergate Hotel. Now, I've quoted Robinson Jeffers a lot of time that it's not compulsory to take these deals, that you don't have to. In his poetry, he writes that there's nothing compulsory about corruption. And she didn't have to take the money, but involved in getting this pipeline, there's Mr. Inman from the old Task Force 157, who worked with Robert Keith Gray, George Bush, close links to the CIA continuously, Edwin Wilson, Frank Churchill, the whole gang, and they latch on to the Hatfields, who accept the money, and now he's in deep trouble. He's running for the Senate. He's in deep trouble. He fell for the bait, and these people had all the contacts with General Dynamics. Again, General Dynamics was in Dallas, Texas. The role in the assassination involved Max Clark, the chief of security there, a friend of Lee Oswald's friend, in quotes, Marina Oswald and Gally Clark. General Dynamics, Rockwell, Bobby Inman, the Tongson Park. Poor Hatfields get trapped in there, don't look into what's happening, and any more than the French, when they celebrated the Nazis leaving, followed up in the years to come how their police departments, again, were to be run by the Nazi cells. Now, another person who got sucked in 2 times was Geraldine Ferraro. The first was the election unit in 1979. The Federal Election Commission questioned her about the money that she got to get into the House of Representatives. The agency folded over their investigation. There was $109,000 in illegal family loans to her when she went into Congress, and one of the members on that commission is Mr. Friedersdorf, Friedersdorf, who later served as President Reagan's congressional liaison, who knew that this thing could stir up again with Geraldine Ferraro. They may not know that she would run for vice president, but they knew she'd run in the House of Representatives. So instead of investigating it, they gave her a little fine of $250, and her husband got a fine of $500 for the campaign. But that's not the point. They had all this information, and they kept it. The illegal loans, sat on it, let her be in the House of Representatives, build herself up, and just as they had Mr. Angleton nominated or supposed to be the vice president with George McGovern, and then they pull out the evidence, John Ehrlichman, that he had electroshock in a mental hospital, and then the Democrats were left without a vice president or disloyal to Angleton and so forth. The San Francisco Examiner has a story, August 17th. Federal Election Commission wasn't happy with Ferraro deal. New York Times, August the 16th, the Ferraro loans. And next week I'll do more if I have time. And Patricia Barrio, the press secretary she hired for, well, I'll just mention it quickly now. She hired her as soon as she was going to tour for her campaigns, and she fired her last week. Barrio was the one who gave Newsweek the story about the funds. Patricia Barrio was married in Rome. She went to Michigan and studied her newspaper work, was married in Rome after a 3-week visit to an Italian there who came to this country and worked for the Drug Enforcement Agency until 1975 under Nixon, under Hunt and Liddy and Caulfield and the Dirty Tricks group that was in the White House under Richard Nixon, Peter Byrne and the whole group, the DEA. And she divorced him. He's the father of 2 sons. And after she divorced him, shortly after that, he was arrested coming from Mexico to Texas with cocaine, and he was put in a Texas jail where he was given a peanut butter sandwich. Maybe you remember the story of this Barrio and can dig up some old articles about that. I have it in my files under the Mafia, and I'll have to pull it out for you. He's the fellow that ate the cyanide sandwich, or strychnine, and he ate a half a sandwich and keeled over in a coma, and 6 months later he died, with links to all the high dealers in and out of the White House, and I'm sure down to the Bolivian connections and the Operation Intercept of Nixon, the Mafia, the Nazis, and the Vatican. That is the woman that was hired to carry the press campaign and travel with Geraldine Ferraro, but after several weeks, she fired her because the woman had given a leaked story to Newsweek, which is typical of what I would expect of this situation, and she got burned also. Because of the Ferraro story smearing her and getting so much news attention, it's also important to know that if Gary Hart had gotten the nomination. He was going to suggest her as vice president also, that the gun was taken away from him. That's who he wanted, and Gary Hart, of course, is close to Mr. Mankiewicz and Robert Keith Gray and the office in Washington, D.C. that is the extension of Paul Laxalt and William Casey and the CIA. So the Democratic Party has a lot of time bombs on it to take away, divert, make them defensive, and smear them. Knowing her background, knowing the husband Zuccarro and who he rented to, now they can pull these stories out and leak them on forever. Now, I want to get to the John DeLorean story, and on the sheet that accompanies this broadcast, I put a little article that was in the Los Angeles Times this week. It was about the co-defendants of John DeLorean that are waiting their sentencing, and I wanted you to have the article instead of quoting it out of context. William Morgan Hattrick was the fellow that was arrested with John DeLorean. He is going to be sentenced now. He has not yet been sentenced. He was described always as one of the busiest drug smugglers in California, and he was never brought in. Part of the plea bargaining, and this is why I wanted you to have the article, part of the plea bargaining was, don't arrest my sons. And that came out only in one other article a while back, and I want you to see it, because the sons have never been arrested. You've never seen their name. It's been 2 years in the news. And Hattrick's sons, Buzz and Jinx Hendricks and Hattrick, and his stepson James Coward. In return, the government promised not to prosecute his sons. Well, what were the sons arrested for? If I'll take all the rap, give up my banks in the Cayman Islands, my airplane line, all 5 airplanes, 12 cars, my accounts in 7 Southern California banks, if you don't take the 3 sons. And I wanted you to see that because that came out this week. Now, that is consistent with what I was told and had on the air for 2 years, the information that along with those 3 sons, that Edwin Wilson's son was with them, and that Hattrick was arrested, that the cocaine that he had, that $24 million worth of cocaine, was cocaine that he did bring in from South America that I was told came from Klaus Barbie. And once again, I'll get in touch with various people that I contacted a while back. I have on the sheet Mr. Ogleston from Detroit, Michigan. That was August the 10th, 1983, about how Hattrick, where he got this $24 million worth of cocaine. And Murray Sams, an attorney in Miami representing a multi-million-dollar suit against John DeLorean. And I sent him a long letter, and I have copies of those letters and the information I sent them. Just a year ago this week, or in 2 days from now, it was August the 29th, the link of Klaus Barbie, Martin Bormann, Josef Mengele to Los Angeles, New York, USA cocaine traffic. Now, if my sources were correct about the arrests, the fact that his sons were arrested is here. They've never seen their name. I've never seen it in the paper for any reason at all. Why would they hide it if the sons were brought in with him? But my source, not the arrest of Hattrick is important with the sons, but it's important because I was told by men who use Hattrick as their pilot that the cocaine came from Klaus Barbie, and we have to reconstruct the chronology of this story because my sons, as the plea bargain part, is there. The San Francisco Examiner has a picture of William Morgan Hattrick, described as one of the biggest drug dealers on the West Coast. He made a plea bargain in June of '83. It doesn't tell why. Now, he made a plea bargain to testify against DeLorean, but you noticed in the trial he never took the stand, not once. And why would they let the sons off if he didn't take the stand? I went back to the early articles of the plea bargaining that I had in June. One was in the Los Angeles Herald, where it says, in the major development, Mr. William Morgan Hattrick will testify for reduced charges. And I had this on the air a year ago, but I want to repeat it now because of DeLorean getting off. He's going to get reduced charges. The U.S. Attorney's Office agreed to drop 2 of the most serious charges against Hattrick in return for his guilty plea, which include a continual criminal enterprise charge, and they're going to try to give him a light sentence on dealing and distributing and so forth the cocaine and minor tax and currency violation charges. But the plea bargaining did not involve testifying against John DeLorean. That's over. It involved not having his sons, that was in the news this week. The Herald, Los Angeles Herald, said that he would testify if he was called as a witness. He would not take the fifth to hide any incriminating information. He would do it, but they wouldn't dare put him on the stand and never asked where the cocaine came from. They couldn't possibly do it. The Los Angeles Times has a story with no mention of the sons last June, and how Hedrick said, I will take the stand and tell you anything you want to know, because he was arrested with DeLorean with the $23 million. Wall Street Journal has the story about John DeLorean, who appeared with two of his co-defendants. One agreed to plead guilty and testify against him. William Morgan Hedrick said that he would testify against him, and this was in all of the papers. Now, the Los Angeles Herald, June 14th, did mention that as part of the deal, the government agreed to drop a continuing enterprise charge against him, adding 2 felony tax evasions. They agreed not to prosecute Hedrick's 3 sons, not to prosecute the 3 sons. And then this article goes on to say, deals are the grease that makes the system work, says a dope lawyer who specializes in making deals with federal prosecutors. Never, not once in a decade of practice, has one of his big-time dope-dealing clients ever gone to trial. Hedrick was known as well as anyone as a big-time dealer. The former business partner of Hedrick was Robert Durand, a millionaire cocaine trafficker. Now, Durand goes back to DeLorean Motors. On the board of the Durand Corporation is Henry Bushkin, the attorney and partner of John DeLorean. And I hope I have time, just briefly, I guess I will, to talk about the death of Truman Capote in the home of Joanne Carson this week. Robert Durand is a millionaire cocaine trafficker. He was under investigation by the Drug Enforcement Agency. And remember, a year ago, I had this with you on the air, and through his attorney is Stephen Wilson, currently Hedrick's attorney, the same attorney for Robert Durand, who is a partner and uses on his board of directors Henry Bushkin, John DeLorean's partner. They contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office and offered a deal in return for immunity from prosecution. Durand supplied the Drug Enforcement Agency with a dozen names involved. One of them, again, was James Timothy Hoffman, I mentioned, who was in drug trafficking, who was working with John DeLorean. Hedrick is another link in a chain of deals between law enforcement agencies and the drug traffic, deals with drug traffickers in the federal court system, and most of them are prosecuted but make deals so that you don't know where they are or who they are. And this was the story that not only mentioned in June of '83, the only other article I have on the sons that were the reason for Hedrick plea bargaining, but the relationship of Hedrick to Robert Durand. There are others, but that is the most blatant and open of the links of Durand, who later I charted out for you, linked to Johnny Carson and Henry Bushkin. Now, the story of Edwin Wilson and the son has never been developed. If the son was involved with those 3 sons who are in the news just once this week and once in June. There was a story in the Houston Post, 1983, plot to kill 7 in trial of ex-CIA agent alleged. And this is about the time when Edwin Wilson hired hit squads to kill 2 Washington prosecutors and 5 federal witnesses against him. 2 of his major witnesses or more have been killed. We've done broadcasts on that. But the government charged that Wilson arranged the delivery of a $10,000 down payment for the murders through an intermediary along with a hit list. The courier was his son, and he was prosecuted for having a hit list, and this is the only mention I have of Edwin Wilson using his son. Now, that son has never been charged as a courier with a plot to kill. He also had a plot and hired somebody to kill his wife, to break her neck, snap her neck and break her because she was giving him a hard time. But to say where the son is, I wouldn't even guess. But the missing factor is, if the Wilson son was involved with Hedrick's sons, then absolutely the Klaus Barbie arrest followed right on top of the DeLorean arrest and the deals that were made. If you get those charts that I have on these various gentlemen that we've had on other broadcasts, you'll get the chronology of the relationship of these people. August the 8th, 1983, it was broadcast number 609. I have the chart of Johnny Carson with the Commercial Bank of California, the links to Henry Bushkin, his partner and his current attorney. And Henry Bushkin is a registered agent for Robert Durand under a company called Radkin Estate. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up at this time, and we did quite a bit before, is that they're still looking for that hidden money. And I keep saying over and over again, go, what I told the FBI and the attorneys in Miami, go to the Swiss bank account in Zurich, Switzerland. Here are the dates. Here is the courier. I have the name of the man who took it. He works for the Associated Press. He's a high-up officer. I gave the name of the man, the courier. They could check his passport because of the links of Durand to Bushkin, Bushkin to Carson, and all of them with DeLorean motors over and over again linked to that group. Now, in checking out this money, and they're trying to look for it, I have to repeat the death of Colin Chapman that I had on broadcast 576. Hetrick and was arrested with DeLorean October the 10th, and then a few months later, Klaus Barbie was arrested, picked up and sent to France, as I say, still not on trial. And just in that time period, December the 17th, Colin Chapman died. And keeping the current news up, I just want to repeat the story of Colin Chapman, described in the New York Times as a designer and builder of automobiles whose ideas changed the face of Grand Prix racing. He died in England apparently of a heart attack. He was 54 years old. He was involved in the development of the DeLorean sports car. The DeLorean Company, in 1981 accounts, released after a long delay, disclosed that Lotus, that's the agency they both took money out of, had paid for engineering work for the John DeLorean car, but that the sports car was being built in Ireland, and the funds were paid by way of a Swiss-based Panamanian company run by DeLorean distributor. Mr. Chapman, while he was still living, denied having any interest in the Panamanian company, but had been expected to be challenged on the John DeLorean relationship at the stockholder meeting of the Lotus car. Mr. DeLorean is awaiting trial on cocaine charges. Well, Mr. Chapman never testified about the Lotus Engineering Company. He was dead shortly after DeLorean was arrested and just in between before Klaus Barbie was arrested. Now, I was particularly upset about the death of Truman Capote. Just coincidentally, he was killed. I think he was killed or died. I wouldn't say who served his food. I don't know who was in the kitchen. He was in the home of Joanne Carson, Johnny Carson's ex-wife. The paper this morning, the San Francisco Chronicle, and all of you saw it coast to coast, autopsy fails to find what killed Capote. The Los Angeles County's coroner, after 3 hours, came to an inconclusive decision. Capote, 59, died at noon Saturday at the home of Joanne Carson, a close friend who was divorced from talk show host Johnny Carson in 1972. Was that an error? 1982, they split up right after all of this hit the fan, and they moved it 10 years away so that she's really not touching the Carson-Durand-Hetrick connections or Bushkin. You understand? Was that a typographical error that they divorced in 72? They split rapidly at that time. It said Capote had been battling alcohol and drug addiction for decades. Where did he get his drugs? Where did John Belushi get his fatal drugs? He's a little tired. He goes to bed. Police Commander William Booth, the old expert who's always quoted by the LAPD, there was no evidence of foul play. Well, nobody knows better than Edwin Wilson and that group that there are drugs that they've administered for years that have no trace of chemicals in their system. So while they look for these traces and they know they won't be there, they'll scrounge around and see if maybe there was something else. Or it said there was no trauma, no cerebral hemorrhage, and no, in quotes, classic heart attack. They didn't put an apparent heart attack this time. They put a classic heart attack. But Truman Capote was a guy who's close to Princess Radziwill, Jackie Onassis' sister, to the monarchies, the deposed monarchies around Monte Carlo. The Society said he has a big mouth. I have to get his last book. It was suppressed, and an article in the New Yorker was really hushed up because he named certain high people he wasn't supposed to talk about. Truman Capote understood the Society circle very well, and I had particular reasons to be very sad at his death, and also Tennessee Williams, who was murdered just recently this past year. The circumstances of being in Bel Air, just a few blocks from Larry Flint's home, where Bell and Gordon Ovell and G. Gordon Liddy all moved in. He's at Joanne Carson's home. He's been addicted to drugs for years. He lies down and dies, and of course they're not going to find anything in that body that they can confirm was one way or the other. Story that I pulled out just early in 1984, Johnny Carson, well, it's not too long ago, and Johnny Carson sues the National Enquirer for $50 million. They published a false story of his settlement with his wife. They said that she got $42 million, which is neither here nor there. The suit was filed by Henry Bushkin, again, the attorney that is on the board of Mr. Durant's company, the big drug connection, and Bushkin, he's still representing Johnny Carson, always will. This is a story about their divorce settlement, but that divorce happened when all the cocaine connections came apart right after Belushi was dead in L.A., and these links to South America, every time they come up or the deaths come up of primary witnesses, I will bring it out, because we're right now at the door of Hollywood and New York, the heavy cocaine users, the people who have to kill, hush up, make deals, get them off, courts can't run. This is what is going on. Now, in the news this past week, the Bolivian government is cracking down on the Nazi groups that have been doing the cocaine connection. Is there a coincidence between wanting now to get the Nazis? The United States was involved in an attempted coup where they would have worked with the Nazis and Klaus Barbie if they could. That was in the news just last August the 10th, 1984, and I had on the broadcast how the CIA had actually kidnapped the president of Bolivia and released him, and now he is cracking back. Well, the way he can crack back is to stop the cocaine connections that fund the Nazis. The New York Times has a story this week, August 21st, tell of destroying 2 factories and seizing cocaine in Bolivia. Mr. Ali Parada is reported to work closely with Mr. Gomez. This is one of the people that are cracking down. He is hiding, and it has been indicted in Miami on cocaine trafficking. Mr. R.C. Gomez took part in the military coup in 1980 and is interior minister and paramilitary with the Nazi groups whose activities have been financed with cocaine money, Bolivian drug enforcement officials say. So the New York Times this week is referring, or this past week, to the Nazi connections to cocaine in Bolivia. And I believe that as DeLorean money is investigated more and more, and the courts are going into it now, there's going to be a lot more heat on these various connections if they're allowed to go to trial. Now, they may hush up and let the statute of limitations run out in Detroit because it's so important to miss these connections. To repeat what I had, this was on broadcast 608. Last August, John DeLorean was arrested. I had November, it was October 19th, 1982 with Mr. Hetrick. Klaus Barbie was arrested in January of 83. 3 months later, Colin Chapman died December the 12th, 82. So the DeLorean Hetrick arrest, Chapman is dead from the Lotus to hide the Panamanian Swiss money. Barbie, who allegedly is involved with Mengele's and Bormann with a deposit, DeLorean's deposit in the Swiss bank in Zurich. DeLorean is pulled in January 83 and is sitting there, it will be almost 2 years and not to trial. And I mentioned that the Zurich bank and the numbered bank account that was put in Zurich, not the exact number, but the dates it was deposited. Now, the Hetrick story and the way the rest was set up, I've detailed for you, but to run now in the time that's allotted, the Detroit case may sour the DeLorean victory. You've seen some of those articles. That the Lotus Car Company is involved in the investigation. The money went to GPD between mid-September 1979. It was supposed to go to the Lotus Car. Money from Panama went to Switzerland. It was supposed to go to the car company in England that was helping design the car. The money was never paid to Lotus, and Mr. Chapman died. Our time is out now, so I'll continue on this in the weeks to come because I want to pursue it till we find Mengele's Barbie and Hollywood cocaine all tied together. This is Mae Brussell.